The subcommittee will come to order. Today we're going to have opening statements regarding three important bills that the committee will be voting upon tomorrow. H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, sponsored by Dr. Cassidy. H.R. 1900, the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act, sponsored by Mr. Pompeo. And H.R. 83, sponsored by Ms. Christensen. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. The Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013 is a critical piece of legislation that will finally put some interagency checks and balances on the EPA, an agency that, in my opinion, is single-handedly controlling the energy policy of the United States. The number of major new rules coming out of the EPA has been prolific, especially those aimed at basically putting the coal industry out of business. In fact, just last week, EPA released its regulatory roadmap, which outlines EPA's plans to regulate, in addition to new and existing coal-fired plants, everything from pollution runoff from military ships to landfill methane emissions to formaldehyde emissions from particle board and plywood. No sector of the U.S. economy is safe from EPA's overreach. Importantly, the Energy Consumers Relief Act gives the Department of Energy the lead role in conducting a multi-agency analysis of EPA energy-related rules estimated to cost at least $1 billion. No longer will the impact of these measures on energy prices, jobs, or manufacturing competitiveness be a secondary consideration that is hidden from the public view. It is now more important than ever to weigh the consequences of EPA's actions, particularly in a struggling economy that we still are trying to create jobs. The U.S. is on a pathway to unprecedented energy self-sufficiency, thanks to technological innovations that have allowed us to safely tap the nation's abundant energy resources. Without the additional checks and balances provided by H.R. 1582, this pathway will remain threatened by an agency that fails to provide the American people with a transparent and accurate picture of the cumulative and sweeping impact of its regulations. For these reasons, I encourage all of my colleagues to support H.R. 1582. Equally critical is Mr. Pompeo's legislation, H.R. 1900, which is a bipartisan bill that would modernize the federal review process for natural gas pipeline permit applications. Now, we had a hearing about this morning. Some suggestions were made by Commissioner Mueller and others of way to improve this bill. And I know that Mr. Pompeo is committed to working with all sides to make this bill better as we go to full committee. But our energy landscape has been dramatically transformed over the last decade or so, but our energy infrastructure still lags behind regarding capacity. So to take full advantage of our abundant natural gas supplies, we do need a new, modern pipeline system. By making common sense reforms to the natural gas pipeline permitting process, Mr. Pompeo's legislation will now allow new pipeline projects to come online safely and efficiently, and I would encourage all of my fellow members to support this legislation. And then also, I mentioned Ms. Christensen's legislation in my opening statement, and I'm sure that she'll be talking more about that important legislation as well. That's H.R. 83. So with that, Mr. Rudd, okay. At this time, I'd like to recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we begin today's markup, fires are raging across the West. 10 days ago, one such fire tragically claimed the lives of 19 firefighters in Arizona. Last month, Colorado experienced the most destructive wildfire in the state's history, a blaze that claimed 2 lives, cost $9 million to fight, and inflicted more than $90 million in damages. Fires are part of the West, but scientists have told us time and again that by burning fossil fuels, we're warming the climate, and this warming is leading to worsening droughts, more intense wildfires, and other climate disasters. As these fires tragically illustrate, the energy choices we make today will have a profound effect on the world our children will inherit. We have a moral duty to craft energy policies that protect the planet and future generations. One of the bills we're going to consider is Congresswoman Christensen's bill. It's precisely the kind of legislation we should be working on. The bill enhances energy security and expands renewable energy generation. It's a win for the island states and U.S. territories that it will assist, and I commend the chairman for bringing this bill before the subcommittee. But I cannot say the same about the two other energy bills we will consider. They are partisan messaging bills that I don't believe will become law, and they do nothing to address the serious climate and energy challenges that we face as a nation. Mr. Pompeo's bill, H.R. 1900, seeks to speed up the approval of interstate natural gas pipelines. The bill aims to solve a problem that doesn't exist. GAO has concluded that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission pipeline permitting is predictable and consistent and gets pipelines built. The pipeline companies agree. Earlier today, they testified that the process, quote, is generally very good, end quote. Nevertheless, H.R. 1900 would carelessly change this functioning permitting process by arbitrarily limiting the time that FERC and other agencies have to review pipeline applications. When faced with these time limits, one of two things will happen. Either agencies will approve permits that do not comply with our nation's health, safety, and environmental laws, or they will deny permits when the time limits prevent them from completing legally mandated pipeline reviews. With this bill, we will get rushed decisions and probably more project denials. No one benefits from that, not even the pipeline companies. Mr. Cassidy's bill, H.R. 1582, also is problematic. It is yet another science-denying attack on EPA. At some point, we need to stop acting like members of the Flat Earth Society and start listening to the scientists. The bill relies on an outlandish premise that EPA's public health and environmental protections provide no benefits at all to the American people. We know this premise to be false. EPA's tailpipe standards, for example, produce net benefits to society of up to $450 billion. The benefits of the mercury and air toxics rule and other major rules are similarly huge. And yet, H.R. 1582 directs the Department of Energy to conduct a skewed, cost-only analysis of EPA's energy-related rules. If, based on this cost-only analysis, DOE determines that a rule could have significant adverse effects to the economy, the bill blocks EPA from finalizing the rule. This is true even if the rule's economic benefits dramatically outweigh its costs. This is not a sensible approach. It dangerously undermines our nation's bedrock environmental laws. We should not be wasting our time with a bill that would create an unprecedented DOE veto of EPA rules and result in indefinite delays of important public health protections. We have real climate and energy problems to solve and should be seeking real solutions. As I've been saying for nearly 3 years, I'm ready to put aside my own policy preferences to tackle these problems in a bipartisan way. Let's stop these message bills and start crafting solutions. Yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. This time recognize Mr. Upton, the chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our ongoing effort to protect and create jobs, we're here today to consider 3 important bills. H.R. 1900, the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act, sponsored by Mr. Pompeo. H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, sponsored by Dr. Cassidy. And H.R. 83, sponsored by Ms. Christensen. As this subcommittee has explored on previous occasions, America is blessed with vast amounts of energy resources, including natural gas. But in order to capitalize on this new energy abundance and create jobs, we need to build new pipeline infrastructure to deliver these robust supplies to new markets and new customers. However, our current permitting process results in significant delays and uncertainty, given the number of state and federal agencies that have a myriad opportunities to stall approval of the necessary permits. If we're going to take advantage of our newfound energy abundance and boost our economy, we've got to start modernizing our existing permitting process to align it with current and future energy realities. That's why I support H.R. 1900, the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act. This legislation puts the federal permitting process on a reasonable shot clock with clear deadlines so that all federal and state permitting agencies are held accountable. The certainty provided by this legislation will help natural gas pipeline projects get sited and built without undue delay, while also ensuring such projects are safe and certainly environmentally sound. Another important piece of energy legislation being considered today is the Energy Consumers Relief Act. Under this thoughtful legislation, energy-related regulations issued by EPA that cost more than $1 billion will finally get the cumulative analysis that they warrant. Common sense dictates that we should fully understand the cost of new regulations on jobs and the economy before they're implemented. Dr. Cassidy's bill will empower the DOE to take a look-before-you-leap approach to EPA's energy-related billion-dollar rules. Transparency in regulatory costs is a reasonable expectation, and the Energy Consumers Relief Act will make sure that EPA provides it. And given the prolonged weakness in the economy and stubbornly high gas prices and unemployment rates, it's a level of scrutiny that's long overdue. Finally, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 83, which would require the Secretary of the Interior to assemble a team of experts to address the energy needs of the insular areas of the U.S. and freely associated states through the development of an energy action plan. I urge all of my colleagues to support every one of these three common-sense energy bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. This time I call on the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, while I support H.R. 83, a bill to require the Secretary of the Interior to develop an action plan to address the energy needs of the insular areas of the U.S. and the freely associated states. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I believe that there's more work that must be done to this, to H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, and H.R. 1900, the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1900 will provide a solution in search of a problem. As we've heard today, that 90% of the pipeline applications are approved within 9 to 12 months already. And the other 10% involve complicated reviews that require additional time and scrutiny. So H.R. 1900 is indeed an unnecessary bill that will force FERC to make a decision on a proposed pipeline, regardless if the agency was able to complete its due diligence. In addition, Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1582 provides another example of the majority parties undermining the public health aspects of the EPA regulations and instead only focusing on potential costs to industry. Mr. Chairman, we know that EPA does not simply propose new regulations willy-nilly or pull them out of thin air. In fact, every rule that EPA has proposed has been mandated by law, specifically to protect the public health by ensuring that all citizens have access to clean air, land, and water. The bill before us is flawed in that it will give the Secretary of Energy unprecedented authority to effectively veto EPA public health regulations if the Secretary found that the rule would cause any, and I quote, significant adverse effects to the economy, end of quote. The analysis called for in this legislation is so skewed that even if the economic benefits of a rule dramatically outweigh any significant adverse effects to the economy, or rather to industry's profit, the rule would still be blocked. Mr. Chairman, I find it curious that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are quick to point out that carbon emissions in the U.S. are down to mid-90s levels, but refuse at the same time to acknowledge that EPA regulations implemented under the Clean Air Act played a major role in reducing harmful air pollutants by 60%, while at the same time our economy has grown by over 200%. Mr. Chairman, my Republican colleagues cannot have it both ways. They cannot attack EPA for issuing regulations while at the same time point to the progress that we have made as a nation, both environmentally and economically, due in large part to those very same EPA rules. Mr. Chairman, I can't support this bill, H.R. 1582, nor H.R. 1900 as they are currently drafted. I believe that both of these bills are unnecessary, they are bad policy, and I simply urge the majority to work with our side to introduce bipartisan, common-sense legislation that will actually help move our nation's energy policy forward. With that, I yield back 8 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having a open markup tomorrow on these three bills, Energy Consumer Relief Act, Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act, and a bill that would require the Secretary of the Interior to develop an action plan to address the energy needs of the insular areas of the United States and freely associated states. It's an interesting process where we sit here and talk to each other, giving opening statements that nobody listens to, but at least we do create a record. I wasn't here in the 1930s or the 40s or the 50s or the 60s or the 70s when a lot of these base energy bills and base environmental bills became law. But in studying the history, I am certain of one thing, Mr. Chairman, and that is the political climate was different when these laws became laws. There was an assumption that everybody wanted progress and economic development, and that these laws would create a level playing field that would reject bad actors but allow good actors and good projects to go forward. Well, when you flash forward to the 21st century and where we are today, you now have these outside so-called environmental protection groups with professional staffs that exist as soon as a project is even projected or presented for a permit. Lawsuits are filed, and Freedom of Information Acts or requests are presented. The assumption is that any project is a bad project and should be stopped. And the EPA especially has adopted murkier and murkier rules to do what they call their analysis, and they always project great public health benefits and lives saved or premature deaths prevented, but they never really come forward, Mr. Chairman, with the databases and the assumptions and the modeling to back those up. So the Energy Consumer Relief Act simply says if a regulatory impact is going to be more than $1 billion, show us where these assumptions, show us the detail, show us the data, show us the protocol that was used to make that decision. I don't think that's a negative thing. I support that. I support the Permitting Reform Act of Mr. Pompeo, and I support the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands bill that requires a study to address the energy needs. I think they're all good bills, and I hope that we can endorse them tomorrow. I may have some amendments if the chair supports them. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. At this time, I call on the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
3 minutes. Sorry. 3 minutes.
I have to talk fast now. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I certainly support H.R. 83, and I want to talk primarily about H.R. 1900. I've been following this issue closely, and I want to thank Mr. Pompeo for having some early discussions with my office and several others in an attempt to make this bill bipartisan. While those early discussions were not successful, I'm hopeful concerns with parts of this bill can be addressed through this markup or afterwards. It's important for our committee to make progress on these issues in a bipartisan manner. There are numerous energy and environmental issues that face our country and the world, and we must do everything together to address these problems. Greater use of natural gas has helped us to reduce our carbon pollution. It's a step in the right direction, but obviously not the end of the conversation. Many of my constituents rely on natural gas for electricity and for heating their homes. I don't want them to see a rise in their bills or a shortage during the harsh New York winters because of red tape or non-responsive agencies. I believe we must do everything to make ourselves energy independent in this country, but also we need to address environmental concerns. I have concerns about certain language in this bill that could have negative environmental effects. The deemed approved language is a specific problem. While I understand the industry's need for finality on projects, it cannot be done at the expense of proper agency review of projects. I'm also troubled by the language that forces agencies to make a yes or no decision by a certain deadline. The language could lead agencies to decline permits, for instance, because they need more time, and I think that would have the opposite effect that the sponsor of this bill would like. We must allow the agencies to complete their work within a reasonable time frame. Again, I hope that we can work out these concerns during the committee process and produce an actual bipartisan piece of legislation that helps to streamline government, protect the environment, and enhance our energy production. The bill, as written, will not pass the other body. Let's get together and improve the bill so that it can pass both houses and be signed into law. It'll take a little give and take on both sides. I'm willing. I hope everybody else is. And again, I thank the gentleman for his courtesies. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Scalise, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing and the markup that we're going to have on these 3 pieces of legislation that we're considering that are not only very important, but I'm also happy to support all 3. My colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, has introduced H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act, that prohibits the EPA administrator from finalizing any energy-related rule estimated to cost more than $1 billion if the Secretary of Energy determines that the rule will have significant adverse effects on the economy. This is a common-sense bill that ensures the EPA evaluates all the rules to determine future costs on families and on our economy prior to finalizing them. In addition, if the rule is determined to cause increases in energy prices, the relevant federal agencies must be consulted to determine if the increases will cause further harm to the economy. We've seen so many times, we've had hearings from the EPA as we talk to families. When I go back home to my district, it seems that the EPA is probably the biggest impediment to job creation so far that we've seen by this administration, maybe rivaled by the President's health care law that he's acknowledging has so many problems that he's putting some of it off for a year. But when you look at some of these rules coming out of the EPA, they have nothing to do with health. It's more focused on pursuing a radical agenda. And when we have them here in front of our committee and we ask them, do they consider the economic impact And many times they just shrug it off and say, no, that's not a consideration. Well, it is to families, and it is to small businesses who have to pay these costs. And shouldn't we consider that? Shouldn't that be part of the discussion? What is the EPA afraid of? If they feel that there's certain justification to do something, that's what Congress is for. If they're passing these rules and regulations, in many cases where we don't even think they have legal authority, and so many of them have such a high impact on costs and raising energy prices on families, this is common sense, and I appreciate that my colleague from Louisiana brought this bill forward. H.R. 1900, the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act by Mr. Pompeo, reforms the Natural Gas Act to streamline and reform the process by which natural gas pipelines are approved. This bill ensures that once FERC finalizes its assessment, other federal and state agencies act in a timely fashion to respond to the permit approval. It's been talked about regarding a shot clock. And you know, when you look at this revolution in natural gas that has literally transformed regions of our country, it's created so many jobs across our country, and yet when you look at the slowdown and the uncertainty when it comes to permitting natural gas, I think it's only fair that federal agencies and Washington bureaucrats are held accountable and given some kind of time frame to answer and make some of these decisions because jobs are at stake. And so I think it's very important that we bring this as well. And H.R. 83 is a bill dealing with the Department of Interior, asking them to come up with a plan of action on their own. I think it's a good bill as well, so I'm happy to support all three of these bills. Thank the Chairman for bringing all of this forward, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the markup today, or at least opening statements. Tomorrow we'll mark up all three different bills. The first, H.R. 83, introduced my colleague, Mr. Christensen, would require the Secretary of Interior to develop an action plan to address the energy needs of the insular areas of the United States and the freely associated states. I applaud the majority's willingness to consider legislation from our side of the aisle. I plan to support the bill and hope we'll continue to consider bills from both sides that are sound policy. The second bill we have here is an Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013. Many of the rules in this bill aims to stop our rules that are directly affect my constituent companies, rules that I have serious issues in how they're developed. As I said in the hearing on this in April, I'd love to have a bill that would require Department of Energy to have an official consulting role similar to OMB on the drafting of EPA rules where appropriate. That said, I continue to amaze that my colleagues are okay at setting a precedent where one department has veto power over another department or agency's actions. There is to be a way that this committee can address these core concerns we have about the way these rules are developed without completely gutting an agency's statutory responsibility and independence. I strongly oppose the bill and encourage my colleagues on the other side to think twice before setting this precedent. Finally, the third bill we mark up is H.R. 1900 that we held a hearing on this morning. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 included several provisions aimed at improving pipeline permitting process by allowing closer coordination between state and federal agencies. FERC was designated as a lead agency for natural gas infrastructure involving interstate commerce. This provided FERC with the authority to set timelines for other permitting agencies to act. Based on the hearing this morning, it sounds like they're doing a really good job with 90% of the projects being approved the first time around. I'm not convinced we need the legislation at all. Like we say in Texas, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I hope that the following issues are dealt with before we mark up this bill in the committee. Perhaps we should explore making pre-filing mandatory for pipelines as it is in LNG facilities. Commissioner Moeller seemed to encourage this morning. The bill should be amended to ensure that a 12-month clock does not start until the Commission has certified that the application is complete. A 12-month deadline for all applications before they're complete would result in truncated and inadequate environmental analysis, which would adversely impact FERC decision-making and potentially expose FERC-issued certificate to litigation. Lastly, the deemed approved language needs to be removed for both policy and political reasons. If we learned anything from the last Congress, from the last Natural Resources bill that were voted on in the House and then sent to the Senate, if there is no broad bipartisan support for that type of policy in the House, it's a non-starter in the Senate. If you truly want to give these companies regulatory certainty, which is what every one of my friends on the other side say this morning, and we need to send something to the floor that has a fighting chance in the Senate. This draft does not have that fighting chance. I expect that if you all moved on these three issues, it would be more support on our side of the aisle in the Senate. We wanted to see pipelines permitted in a timely way, but the permitting process is working pretty well right now, and we don't want to create any new problems or unintended consequences. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is no doubt that this country has the potential for a very bright and promising energy future. Recent technological advances have opened up access to once unavailable domestic sources of energy, unleashing a number of positive economic effects. In Ohio, this energy renaissance has been a life source to small towns and communities as they've struggled to recover from dire economic conditions. Today, many of these towns have bustling main streets, new sources of revenue, and employment rates well below the national average. New access to less expensive natural gas has also been fueling a flurry of activity in the manufacturing sector. I represent 60,000 manufacturing jobs in my district, which have benefited greatly from lower natural gas prices. During many of my district meetings and visits, I always hear about the concerns regarding unnecessary government interference and onerous government regulations. It is very clear to my constituents that the best approach for Washington is to ensure that a regulatory framework that encourages growth, not hamper it. That is why I'm especially supportive of Representative Cassidy's bill, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013. In the face of President Obama's proposals for new taxes, unjustified mandates, and efforts to impose failed cap-and-trade policies, this legislation provides a respite to the energy sector. It will require the EPA to abide by certain checks and balances when the agency proposes a rule estimated to cost at least $1 billion over the life of the rule. More specifically, the EPA will be required to submit a cost analysis to Congress that will lay out a rule's impact on gasoline, electricity prices, and any potential job losses. It will further require the EPA to consult with other agencies that stand to be impacted. This sensible approach to regulation is an initiative we can all agree upon. Former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson stated while testifying before this committee in 2011, stated we must regulate sensibly in a manner that does not create undue burdens and that carefully considers both the benefits and the costs. This is precisely what Representative Cassidy's legislation proposes, and I advocate that support for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania and I guess Hall of Fame baseball coach as well, Mr. Doyle, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, or good afternoon. Mr. Chairman, my remarks today address H.R. 1900, and I must note my disappointment, Mr. Chairman, with this legislation. As you know, only this morning was the first legislative hearing held on the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act, and that hearing only further highlighted concerns with this legislation, concerns that I believe, with additional time and consideration, can be addressed. However, here we are 4 hours after the first and only hearing on H.R. 1900, preparing to mark up the bill. While I believe that many aspects of this bill are largely unnecessary, though harmless, I do want to state clearly that I support getting pipeline permits completed in a timely and responsible fashion, and I want to support legislation that will make that process work better. As we have heard in testimony earlier today, there is strong support from many industry stakeholders for additional energy infrastructure. In most cases, FERC is already meeting the timing requirements included in this legislation. Industry frustration with the amount of time some responsible agencies are taking to review these applications is understandable, but it has to be pointed out that they have increasingly limited resources, and the majority continues to cut those budgets further. If codifying standards that have shown to be achievable will put industry at ease, I can support that effort as long as it's done responsibly. Unfortunately, that's not what we have here today. I had hoped that before we reach the subcommittee markup that we would be able to solve a few of the remaining issues with the bill. Specifically, I was hoping to find mutually agreeable reforms to subsection 7J3, which would deem approved any application that has been pending before a responsible agency for longer than 120 days. Mr. Chairman, that is the definition of irresponsible. the consequences of deeming approved an application simply because of an arbitrary number of days have passed could be severe. Rushed or incomplete assessments of applications could lead to serious environmental hazards and, as our witnesses pointed out early, pose a threat to human safety. Moreover, agencies could be tempted to deny applications simply because they couldn't meet the timeline provided, which is surely not what this legislation is intended to do. I'm disappointed that we're rushing this bill through the subcommittee without addressing these concerns, and therefore I must oppose this bill in its current form. It's my hope that we might be able to find consensus on these issues before the full committee markup next week so that I can support it in the end. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, the author of H.R. 1582, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, to be considered. The EPA has recently been advancing an expansive regulatory assault on the production and distribution of affordable, reliable energy. Numerous regulations, many proposed within a short time, have created regulatory uncertainty, contributed to an unprecedented number of announced power plant shutdowns, thereby destroying jobs, increasing energy costs, and raising concerns about electric reliability. Although the EPA purports benefits, the EPA has acknowledged limitations and uncertainties in its analysis. For example, in the regulatory impact analysis of its proposed ozone standards, EPA stated that there are significant uncertainties in both cost and benefit estimates for the full range of standard alternatives. Mr. Waxman kind of snidely calls Republicans flat earthers and suggests we listen to the scientists. I absolutely agree. Let's listen to the scientists. The National Academy of Science found that the EPA had problems with clarity and transparency in its 2011 assessment of formaldehyde and overstated its findings. Dr. Peter Wahlberg, former member of the Harvard School of Public Health, testified that there are major questions regarding the EPA's forecast of serious health effects. He goes on to say that their statistical approach is fraught with numerous assumptions and uncertainties. Dr. Tony Cox from the Colorado School of Public Health testified, the use of statistical associations is not only technically incorrect, but as practiced by EPA and others, highly misleading to policymakers. I could go on. We should move beyond insults and indeed listen to the scientists. Now, that is the point of the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013. This legislation will help ensure energy costs, economic and job impacts are given appropriate consideration in relation to future EPA regulations. Independent and thorough review by federal departments with expertise in energy and economic analysis, led by the Department of Energy, will serve as a check against rules causing significant adverse harm to our economy and jobs. The bill will protect consumers from higher energy prices by providing oversight of the EPA's most expensive rules that regulate the production, supply, and distribution of energy. There should be transparency for those Americans who cannot afford a lobbyist but whose livelihoods are impacted by costly new regulations. The American people cannot afford to have jobs shipped overseas to countries with fewer environmental regulation. Again, I thank Chairman Whitfield for allowing the bill to be considered in the Energy and Power Subcommittee, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Cassidy. At this time, recognize Dr. Christensen, who is the author of H.R. 83, for 3 minutes. Please turn your microphone on, Dr. Christensen.
Affordable, reliable energy while all increasing use of indigenous clean energy resources. This measure will help our nation's insular areas to become less reliant on foreign imports and address our long-standing energy challenges, which have become increasingly complicated by price shocks and the instability in the oil markets over the past few years. The bill requires that the Energy Action Plan identify and offer remedies to the immediate, near-term, long-term, and environmental needs, along with recommendations on how to improve performance of energy infrastructure, overall energy efficiency, and a schedule for implementation of those recommendations. Just to give you a little context for our ongoing dilemma, the average cost of energy is around 11 cents per kilowatt hour in the United States. Residential ratepayers in my district pay around 50.8 cents per kilowatt hour, while commercial ratepayers incur a charge of approximately 54.8 cents. This is nearly 500% or over 500% in some cases of the national average, a cost that is unsustainable and crippling to our economy and the health and safety of our communities. Despite our challenges and obstacles, our territories are diligently working to identify opportunities to promote a diverse portfolio of energy options. Still, this bill is extremely necessary as it recognizes the need for immediate short-term action. I'm encouraged that this can be made a reality with the guidance of a team of experts dedicated solely to mitigating and resolving these issues. Given our individual geographic locations, we don't have the privilege of tapping into nearby grids in times of crisis. This bill will help us to transition along with the rest of the country to resources that are much more affordable, reliable, efficient, and clean. All of these factors converge. As all of these factors converge, we know there is no better time than the present to aggressively pursue the deployment of technologies such as solar and wind to the extent possible, LNG, LPG, geothermal, and ocean, wave, and thermal energy sources. Many states have enacted strong energy plans that chart a way forward, considering all of the options available to them. It's only fitting that our territories also join in the race for energy independence and clean energy leadership. I encourage my colleagues to continue to support this measure, and I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, the author of H.R. 1900, for 3 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for holding this markup this afternoon. Thanks for the hearing this morning on the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation that's aimed at making some pretty simple common sense reforms to the natural gas pipeline permitting process. It is not intended as a messaging bill. It's intended to help consumers and pipeline companies and businesses both create jobs and infrastructure all across America. This bill does not eliminate environmental regulations or permitting requirements. Rather than doing that, it takes a bipartisan approach and simply asks the agencies involved in permitting of natural gas pipelines to finish their work in a timely manner. The legislation builds off reforms made in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which placed FERC as the lead agency for interstate gas pipelines. But because we've had this enormous boom, this great opportunity presented to us by natural gas production, and the increased demand for that natural gas as a source of electricity generation, this process created in 2005 is already in need of modernization. The legislation proposed in H.R. 1900 is not a magic bullet. It does not guarantee the immediate construction of natural gas pipelines. It doesn't change the Clean Water Act. It doesn't change the Clean Air Act. As much as I'd like to see some changes to each of those, and I'd like to see more pipelines built immediately, that's simply not feasible in today's political environment. I think these common sense reforms, however, are possible. The legislation simply gives companies looking to invest in gas pipeline infrastructure some degree of certainty regarding how long a permitting process will take, and brings the statute up to date given current demands for pipeline infrastructure. We heard some ideas this morning in the hearing. I'm happy to consider them and work with the committee to see if we can incorporate them into this legislation as it moves forward. I appreciate Mr. Engel's comments. We did work hard with his staff and some of the staffs on the other side of the aisle. We simply were unable to reach an agreement that moved us past this point. I hope as we move forward in the hearing process, the markup process, we can address some of their concerns while still achieving the important goal of allowing pipeline infrastructure to be built, allow the folks who are investing billions of dollars in doing so to have the certainty that they need. I'd like to give special thanks to Congressman Matheson for being an original co-sponsor of the Natural Gas Pipeline Permitting Reform Act, and I hope we'll be able to get other Democrats from across the aisle to join us in tackling this important and growing issue. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes the opening statements for the markup schedule for tomorrow. So at this time, the chair would call up H.R. 1582 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 1582, to protect consumers by prohibiting the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency from promulgating as final certain energy-related rules that are estimated to cost more than $1 billion and will cause significant adverse effects to the economy.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Now, for the information of members, we're now on H.R. 1582. The subcommittee will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m., and I would remind members that the chair will give priority recognition to amendments offered on a bipartisan basis. So I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, and without objection, the committee stands in recess.